Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most wonderfully absurd tales from the dusty corners of patent history, where bureaucracy meets the simple human need for rest. Picture yourself in a cramped, poorly ventilated office building in downtown Chicago, circa 1903, where the air hangs thick with cigarette smoke and the scratching of fountain pens against paper creates a constant hypnotic rhythm. The walls are lined with filing cabinets that stretch toward water-stained ceilings, and somewhere in this maze of legal documents and administrative tedium, a man named Albert Cornelius Weatherby sits hunched over his desk, convinced he's about to revolutionize the way humanity sleeps. You can almost smell the musty leather of the law books, feel the weight of his wool vest against his chest as he breathes heavily through his mustache, completely unaware that he's about to become one of history's most delightfully unsuccessful inventors. Fair warning though, this story moves at the pace of molasses in January, and you probably won't survive the sheer mundane brilliance of bureaucratic incompetence without drifting off somewhere between the third filing attempt and the seventh rejection letter. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported back to that autumn morning in 1903, watching as Albert Cornelius Weatherby adjusts his wire-rimmed spectacles and carefully dips his pen into the inkwell for what must be the 100th time today. The gas lamps flicker slightly in the Chicago Patent Office, casting dancing shadows across the mountains of paperwork that seem to multiply like rabbits in springtime. Albert's fingers are stained with ink, his collar slightly wilted from the humidity that seems to seep through the brick walls no matter the season. You can hear the distant clatter of the elevated train as it rounds the corner on State Street, its rhythm almost hypnotic as it blends with the soft shuffling of papers and the occasional clearing of throats from other patent hopefuls seated around the waiting room. The idea had come to Albert 3 months earlier, during what he would later describe in his journal as a moment of profound clarity brought on by extreme exhaustion. He had been working as a junior clerk at the Merchants National Bank, spending his days hunched over ledgers filled with endless columns of figures that seemed to blur together after the 8th hour of continuous scrutinization. The electric lights in the bank were harsh and unforgiving, creating a constant strain on his eyes that left him with throbbing headaches by mid-afternoon. It was during one particularly brutal August day, when the temperature outside had climbed to a sweltering 92 degrees, and the bank's interior felt like the inside of a bread oven, that Albert made his discovery. You watch as Albert, in his memory, leans back in his wooden chair and closes his eyes for just a moment. The numbers on the page before him seem to swim and dance, and without conscious thought, he allows his chin to drop toward his chest. His breathing deepens, becomes more rhythmic, and for exactly 17 minutes, he would later time this precisely, Albert enters what he describes as a state of controlled unconsciousness that provides maximum restorative benefit in minimum time. When he awakens, his mind feels clearer than it has in weeks. The headache that had been building behind his temples has vanished completely, and he finds himself able to work through the remaining 3 hours of his shift with renewed vigor and accuracy. That evening, as Albert walks home through the gas-lit streets of Chicago, dodging horse-drawn carriages, and the occasional early automobile that putters along at a frightening 8 miles per hour. He becomes convinced that he has stumbled upon something revolutionary, not just the act of napping. Heavens, no, people have been napping since time immemorial, but the precise methodology, the specific positioning of the body, the optimal duration, the particular way one should regulate breathing and heart rate to achieve maximum efficiency. This, Albert tells himself as he climbs the 3 flights of stairs to his modest boarding house room, is something that can be codified, systematized, and most importantly, patented. You follow Albert into his cramped quarters, watching as he lights the oil lamp on his writing desk and pulls out a worn leather journal. The room smells of lamp oil and the faint mustiness that seems to permeate all boarding houses of the era. His bed is narrow and covered with a quilt his mother made before her passing, and the single window looks out onto an alley where cats yowl at all hours of the night. But Albert pays no attention to these modest surroundings as he begins to write, his pen moving with fervent enthusiasm across the page. The Weatherby method of systematic rest, he writes at the top of the page, underlining it twice for emphasis. A revolutionary approach to daytime sleep optimization. For the next 4 hours, Albert documents every detail of his afternoon revelation. The angle at which the head should tilt, precisely 15 degrees forward from vertical. The positioning of the hands, folded loosely in the lap, with the thumbs touching lightly to create what he calls a circuit of tranquility. The breathing pattern, 4 counts in through the nose, hold for 2 counts, 6 counts out through slightly parted lips. The mental preparation, a specific sequence of thoughts designed to quiet the mind and prepare it for restorative unconsciousness. As the weeks pass, you observe Albert testing and refining his method with the dedication of a true scientist. He times his naps with a pocket watch inherited from his grandfather, keeping meticulous records of duration, recovery time, and subsequent productivity levels. He experiments with different positions, head resting on folded arms versus supported by the chair back, feet flat on the floor versus elevated on a small stool, eyes completely closed versus allowing a thin sliver of light to filter through barely parted lids. Each variation is cataloged, analyzed, and either incorporated into the method or discarded as inefficient. His fellow clerks at the bank begin to notice Albert's transformation, where once he would grow sluggish and irritable by mid-afternoon, now he seems to maintain consistent energy throughout the entire workday. His accuracy with figures improves dramatically, and his supervisor, Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, even comments favorably on Albert's renewed dedication to his duties. But Albert keeps his secret to himself, convinced that premature disclosure might compromise his plans for patent protection. You sit with Albert in the reading room of the Chicago Public Library on a rainy October evening, watching as he researches the patent process with the same methodical approach he applied to perfecting his napping technique. The library is nearly empty, except for a few other scholars hunched over their books, and the sound of rain against the tall windows creates a gentle percussion that makes you want to close your own eyes and drift away. Albert has surrounded himself with legal texts, patent guides, and examples of successful applications. His notebook fills with careful observations about the requirements for patentability, novelty, usefulness, and non-obviousness. The novelty requirement troubles Albert initially. Surely people have been napping since the dawn of humanity. But as he delves deeper into his research, he becomes convinced that his systematic approach, his precise methodology, his careful documentation of optimal conditions and techniques transforms the simple act of napping into something entirely new and patentable. It's not just sleeping, he tells himself as he walks home through the gaslit streets. It's an engineered system for maximizing restorative efficiency. The usefulness requirement seems obviously satisfied. Who wouldn't benefit from more efficient rest? Albert envisions a world where his method is taught in schools, practiced in offices, recommended by physicians. The potential applications seem limitless. Factory workers maintaining alertness during long shifts, students improving their academic performance, mothers finding moments of restoration during demanding days with small children. Non-obviousness proves more challenging to establish, but Albert convinces himself that the specific combination of elements in his method, the precise timing and positioning, the regulated breathing pattern, the mental preparation sequence, creates something that goes far beyond what any reasonable person might naturally discover. He begins to draft his patent application with growing confidence. You watch as Albert labors over his application through the long autumn nights of 1903. His boarding house room becomes cluttered with crumpled papers as he struggles to find the precise legal language needed to describe his invention. The oil lamp burns late into the night, casting flickering shadows on the walls as Albert writes and rewrites, determined to craft a document that will convince the patent examiners of his method's revolutionary potential. The application, when finally completed, runs to 27 pages of dense technical prose. Albert describes his systematic method for optimized daytime rest in excruciating detail, complete with diagrams showing proper body positioning, charts documenting optimal nap durations for various age groups and occupations, and step-by-step instructions for implementing what he calls the complete weather-by protocol. He includes testimonials from his fellow boarding house residents, whom he convinced to try his method in exchange for helping with their own small problems, mending clothes, writing letters for those with poor penmanship, sharing his newspaper each morning. Mrs. Gertrude Hoffman, from the room next door, writes enthusiastically about how Albert's method helped her overcome the afternoon fatigue that had plagued her since taking a position at the telephone company. Mr. Jacob Peterson, a Swedish immigrant who works at the stockyards, testifies that the Weatherby method allowed him to maintain his strength throughout his grueling 12-hour shifts. Even young Timothy Morrison, barely 18 and working as a messenger boy for a law firm, provides a glowing endorsement of how the systematic napping approach improved his speed and accuracy in navigating the busy Chicago streets. On November 15, 1903, Albert takes the morning off from his bank job and walks the 12 blocks to the patent office with his carefully prepared application tucked safely in a leather portfolio under his arm. The morning is crisp and clear, with just a hint of winter in the air, and Albert's breath forms small clouds as he walks with determination through the bustling streets. Horse-drawn carriages clatter past, their wheels striking the cobblestones in rhythms that remind Albert of the regulated breathing pattern that forms the foundation of his method. The patent office building is imposing, with its tall stone facade and heavy wooden doors that seem designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Albert pauses on the steps, adjusting his tie and checking once more to ensure his application is properly organized. Inside, the building echoes with the sounds of bureaucracy, shuffling papers, muffled conversations, the steady click of typewriter keys from somewhere deep within the maze of offices and corridors. You follow Albert to the reception desk, where a stern-looking woman with steel gray hair and wire spectacles peers at him over a stack of forms. Her nameplate reads Miss Prudence Hartwell, and she has the look of someone who has spent decades dealing with hopeful inventors and their often ridiculous ideas. Albert explains his purpose with nervous enthusiasm, and Miss Hartwell slides a thick packet of forms across the desk with practiced efficiency. Application fee is $15, she says, in a voice that suggests she's repeated these words thousands of times. Processing time is approximately 6 to 8 months, longer if additional documentation is required. You'll receive notification by mail regarding the status of your application. Next, Albert retreats to a wooden bench in the waiting area to complete the required paperwork. The forms are intimidating in their complexity, asking for detailed descriptions, technical specifications, and legal declarations that he struggles to understand fully. Other inventors sit around him, some looking confident and businesslike, others appearing as nervous and overwhelmed as Albert feels. There's an elderly gentleman with wild white hair who keeps muttering about his perpetual motion breakfast machine, and a young woman in a practical brown dress who clutches plans for what appears to be an improved typewriter ribbon. After 2 hours of careful form completion, Albert returns to Miss Hartwell's desk and submits his application along with the $15 filing fee, a significant portion of his monthly salary at the bank. Miss Hartwell stamps his receipt with mechanical precision and hands him a carbon copy of his submission. "You'll hear from us," she says, already looking past Albert to the next person in line. Walking back to the bank, Albert feels a mixture of excitement and anxiety. He has taken the first step toward what he believes will be recognition as the inventor of systematic napping. The application is submitted, the fee is paid, and now comes the waiting period that will test his patience more severely than any of his previous challenges. The months that follow pass with agonizing slowness. Albert continues his work at the bank, but his mind frequently wanders to his pending patent application. He imagines receiving a letter announcing approval, pictures himself as the recognized inventor of scientific napping, envisions licensing his method to businesses and institutions across the country. During his lunch breaks, he often walks past the patent office, looking up at its imposing facade and wondering what's happening to his application within those bureaucratic walls. Winter settles over Chicago with its characteristic harshness, and Albert finds himself refining his method even further during the dark, cold months. The systematic napping proves especially valuable during the short days and long nights of the season, when natural energy levels tend to flag by mid-afternoon. He documents these seasonal variations in his journal, convinced that such thorough research will strengthen his patent position. In February, Albert receives his first communication from the patent office. His hands shake as he opens the official envelope, hoping for news of approval. Instead, he finds a form letter requesting additional documentation and clarification of several aspects of his application. The patent examiner, one Harrison J. Pemberton, has questions about the novelty of Albert's invention, the specific technical differences between his method and conventional napping, and the scientific basis for his claims about optimal positioning and breathing patterns. You watch Albert spend the next month crafting a detailed response to Examiner Pemberton's inquiries. He expands his documentation, adds more testimonials from test subjects, and attempts to provide scientific justification for each element of his method. He visits the library repeatedly, searching medical texts for information about sleep physiology, respiratory patterns, the effects of body positioning on rest quality. His response grows to 43 pages, complete with additional diagrams and a bibliography of medical references. The revised application is submitted in March, and again Albert settles into a period of anxious waiting. Spring arrives slowly in Chicago, and Albert begins conducting outdoor tests of his method in the small park near his boarding house. He discovers that the Weatherby method works equally well in natural settings, though he notes that wind conditions and ambient noise levels require slight adjustments to the breathing pattern and mental preparation sequence. Summer brings Albert's second communication from the patent office, and this one is more encouraging. Examiner Pemberton acknowledges the thoroughness of Albert's revised submission and indicates that the application is progressing through the review process. However, there are additional questions about the commercial viability of the invention and its potential applications in various industries. The examiner suggests that Albert might strengthen his application by providing more detailed market analysis and business projections. Albert throws himself into this new challenge with characteristic determination. He spends evenings and weekends researching potential markets for his systematic napping method. He calculates productivity improvements in various industries, estimates the number of workers who might benefit from his technique, and projects potential licensing revenues. His analysis covers factory workers, office clerks, domestic servants, railroad employees, and even students in schools and universities. The expanded application, now running to 71 pages, is submitted in August 1904. Nearly a year after Albert's initial filing, he has invested not only the original $15 fee, but additional costs for revised applications, supplemental documentation, and the numerous trips to the library and patent office. His savings account, never substantial to begin with, has been depleted by his patent pursuit, but Albert remains convinced that approval is imminent. Autumn arrives with unusual warmth, and Albert celebrates the first anniversary of his patent application by conducting a comprehensive test of his method with a group of 20 volunteers recruited from his boarding house, the bank, and his neighborhood. The results are impressive. Participants report improved afternoon alertness, better overall mood, and increased productivity during post-nap periods. Albert documents these findings meticulously, preparing them as additional evidence of his method's effectiveness. In October, Albert receives what will prove to be his final communication from examiner Pemberton. The letter is longer than previous correspondence, and Albert's heart races as he reads the detailed explanation of the Patent Office's decision. The examiner acknowledges the thoroughness of Albert's documentation and the apparent effectiveness of his method. However, the application is being rejected on the grounds that the claimed invention lacks sufficient novelty and non-obviousness to merit patent protection. The letter explains, in language that is both bureaucratic and surprisingly gentle, that while Albert's systematic approach to napping represents careful analysis and documentation, the fundamental act of positioning oneself for short-term rest and the basic physiological processes involved cannot be considered novel inventions. The examiner notes that various cultures throughout history have developed structured approaches to daytime rest, and that the specific elements of Albert's method, while carefully organized, represent obvious variations on practices that have been known for centuries. You sit with Albert in his boarding house room as he reads and rereads the rejection letter, his dreams of patent protection and commercial success crumbling with each paragraph. The oil lamp flickers, casting shifting shadows on the walls as Albert sets the letter aside and stares out his small window at the gas-lit street below. Horse-drawn carriages pass in the darkness, their wheels creating familiar rhythms that once reminded him of his regulated breathing pattern, but now sound merely like the mundane traffic of everyday life. For several days, Albert considers appealing the decision. The patent office procedures allow for appeals, though they require additional fees and more extensive documentation. Albert calculates the costs and realizes that his financial resources are exhausted. More importantly, as he reflects on examiner Pemberton's explanation, he begins to understand the fundamental flaw in his approach. He had been so focused on documenting and systematizing the act of napping that he lost sight of the fact that napping itself, regardless of methodology, cannot be owned or controlled by any individual. The realization brings both disappointment and a strange sense of relief. Albert continues to practice his systematic napping method, and it continues to provide the benefits he originally discovered. His afternoon fatigue disappears, his work performance remains strong, and his overall sense of well-being improves. The method works exactly as he documented, but it works for everyone who tries it, whether they follow his precise protocols or simply find a comfortable position and close their eyes for 15 minutes. Winter returns to Chicago, and Albert settles into a new routine that no longer includes dreams of patent wealth and recognition. He continues working at the bank, where his consistent energy levels and reliable performance earn him a small promotion and a modest salary increase. He shares his napping method freely with anyone who shows interest, no longer concerned about protecting trade secrets or preserving commercial advantages. Mrs. Hoffman from the room next door becomes one of Albert's most enthusiastic converts, and she begins sharing the method with her fellow telephone operators. Peterson teaches the technique to his colleagues at the stockyards, where the brutal physical demands of the work make any opportunity for restorative rest extremely valuable. Young Timothy Morrison spreads word of the method among the messenger boys and junior clerks throughout downtown Chicago, creating an informal network of systematic nappers who refer to themselves with gentle humor as Weatherby disciples. Spring arrives early in 1905, and Albert receives an unexpected letter from a journalist at the Chicago Tribune who has heard about his failed patent application and his systematic napping method. The reporter, Margaret Sullivan, is working on a feature story about unusual patent applications and the inventors behind them. She requests an interview with Albert, expressing particular interest in his careful documentation and the apparent effectiveness of his method despite its rejection by the patent office. The interview takes place on a warm April afternoon in Lincoln Park, where Albert demonstrates his napping technique under the spreading branches of an oak tree. Margaret Sullivan proves to be an insightful interviewer, asking thoughtful questions about Albert's motivations, his research methods, and his reaction to the patent rejection. She seems genuinely interested in the broader questions raised by Albert's experience, who owns traditional knowledge, how innovation relates to documentation, and whether systematic approaches to ancient practices can constitute genuine invention. The resulting article, published in the Sunday Tribune on May 14, 1905, portrays Albert as a sympathetic figure whose careful approach to something as simple as napping reveals both the absurdities of the patent system and the human tendency to seek ownership of universal experiences. The article is titled, "The Man Who Tried to Patent Sleep, a Chicago Clerk's Quest to Own the Nap," and it treats Albert's story with gentle humor while acknowledging the genuine effort and thought he invested in his project. The article brings Albert a brief moment of local celebrity. He receives letters from readers who share their own napping experiences, suggestions for improving his method, and stories of failed patent applications for equally universal activities. One letter from a farmer in Iowa describes an attempt to patent a systematic approach to morning milking routines. Another, from a school teacher in Wisconsin, tells of trying to patent a method for optimal classroom window opening based on temperature, humidity, and student attention levels. Albert realizes that he is part of a tradition of well-meaning individuals who mistake careful documentation for genuine innovation, who confuse systematic approach with patentable invention. The recognition brings him a sense of fellowship with other amateur inventors and a deeper appreciation for the complex relationship between individual effort and collective knowledge. Summer passes peacefully for Albert, who has settled into a comfortable routine of work, systematic napping, and evening walks through the neighborhoods of Chicago. He continues to refine his method, not in hopes of commercial application, but simply for the pleasure of perfecting something that brings him daily benefit. His journal entries from this period reflect a man who has found contentment in the process of careful observation and incremental improvement, regardless of external recognition or financial reward. In autumn, Albert receives a letter from Harrison J. Pemberton, the patent examiner who rejected his application. The letter is personal rather than official, written on plain stationery rather than patent office letterhead. Pemberton explains that Albert's application was one of the most thoroughly documented he had ever reviewed, and that the systematic approach to napping had intrigued him enough to try it himself. The examiner reports that he has been using Albert's method for several months with excellent results, and he wanted to express appreciation for the careful thought and genuine innovation that went into developing the technique, even though it could not be granted patent protection. Pemberton's letter includes an invitation to correspond about other inventive ideas Albert might be developing, and a suggestion that Albert might consider applying his systematic approach to other areas where careful documentation and methodical analysis could produce genuine innovations. The examiner mentions several areas of technology that are rapidly evolving: electrical applications, mechanical improvements to manufacturing processes, and transportation innovations, where Albert's careful analytical skills might lead to patentable discoveries. Albert considers Pemberton's suggestions seriously, but ultimately decides that his satisfaction comes from the process of systematic investigation rather than the goal of patent protection. He continues to work at the bank, where his reliable performance and growing expertise in financial documentation lead to further promotions and increasing responsibility. The skills he developed while researching and documenting his napping method, careful observation, methodical testing, thorough documentation, prove valuable in his banking career, where accuracy and attention to detail are highly prized. The years pass quietly for Albert Cornelius Weatherby. He becomes a respected figure at the Merchants National Bank, eventually rising to the position of senior clerk and then assistant manager. He never marries, but maintains warm friendships with his fellow boarding house residents and develops a reputation in his neighborhood as someone who can be counted on for thoughtful advice and practical assistance. The systematic napping method continues to spread through informal networks. passed from person to person without any central organization or commercial promotion. Albert encounters practitioners of his technique throughout Chicago and occasionally receives letters from people in other cities who have learned the method from traveling businessmen, visiting relatives, or transferred employees. The method evolves as it spreads, with practitioners adapting Albert's basic principles to their own circumstances and preferences. In 1910, Albert moves from his boarding house room to a modest apartment of his own, where he sets up a comfortable napping area with a special chair positioned to catch the afternoon light, filtering through west-facing windows. His apartment becomes an informal gathering place for friends and neighbors who come to discuss the day's events, share advice about work and family challenges, and often end up learning Albert's systematic approach to afternoon rest. Albert begins keeping a new journal. This one focused not on patent applications or commercial possibilities, but on the simple pleasure of observing how his method continues to help people in their daily lives. He documents stories told by practitioners, the factory foreman who credits systematic napping with preventing industrial accidents during the dangerous afternoon hours when fatigue causes concentration to waver, the seamstress whose afternoon rest breaks allow her to maintain the precise hand control necessary for delicate embroidery work, the streetcar conductor who uses the method during his brief layovers to maintain alertness throughout his long shifts. These stories give Albert a sense of accomplishment that patent protection never could have provided. His method is helping people, improving their daily lives in small but meaningful ways, and spreading naturally through communities without any need for legal protection or commercial promotion. The failure to obtain patent protection, which once seemed like the collapse of his dreams, now appears to have been a necessary step in allowing his innovation to achieve its full potential. As Albert enters his middle years, he reflects on the lessons learned from his patent pursuit. The experience taught him the difference between documentation and innovation, between systematic approach and genuine invention, between individual ownership and collective benefit. He realizes that his greatest success came not from trying to control or commercialize his method, but from sharing it freely and allowing others to adapt and improve it according to their own needs. The Chicago Tribune article from 1905 becomes something of a local legend, reprinted occasionally in other newspapers around the country, as an example of both the absurdities of the patent system and the genuine human desire to contribute something useful to the world. Albert keeps copies of these reprints, not out of vanity, but as reminders of how failure can sometimes lead to more meaningful success than originally imagined. In 1915, on the 12th anniversary of his original patent application, Albert receives a visit from a young journalist who is writing a follow-up story about the inventors featured in Margaret Sullivan's original article. The journalist, Thomas Mackenzie, is interested in what has happened to Albert and his systematic napping method in the years since the patent rejection. Albert, now a distinguished-looking man in his 40s, with graying temples and the confident bearing of someone who has found his place in the world, welcomes Mackenzie into his apartment and shares the story of how his method has evolved and spread. He demonstrates the technique, explains how various practitioners have adapted it to their specific circumstances, and reflects on what he has learned about the nature of innovation and ownership. Mackenzie's resulting article, published in 1916, portrays Albert as a man who found success precisely because he failed to achieve his original goal. The article suggests that Albert's experience illustrates something important about the relationship between individual creativity and collective benefit, about how the most valuable innovations are often those that cannot be owned or controlled by any single person. The article brings Albert renewed attention, including an invitation to speak at a meeting of the Chicago Inventors Association about his experiences with the patent process. Albert accepts the invitation nervously, having never spoken to a large group before, but finds that his story resonates with an audience of fellow inventors who have experienced their own frustrations with patent protection and commercial exploitation of their ideas. Albert's talk, delivered in a small meeting room above a downtown restaurant, focuses on what he calls the paradox of practical innovation. The idea that the most useful inventions are often those that seem too simple or universal to merit patent protection, but that require careful thought and systematic development to achieve their full potential. He encourages his audience to consider whether their primary goal is personal recognition and financial gain, or genuine contribution to human welfare and convenience. The response to Albert's talk is enthusiastic, and he finds himself invited to speak to other groups, employee associations at various businesses, women's clubs interested in domestic efficiency, even a gathering of physicians curious about the physiological aspects of systematic napping. Albert discovers that he has a talent for explaining complex ideas in simple terms and for helping people think about familiar activities in new ways. These speaking engagements lead to what Albert considers his most important contribution, a small booklet titled The Art of Systematic Rest, a practical guide to daytime recovery, which he publishes at his own expense in 1918. The booklet is modest in size and scope, only 32 pages, but it represents Albert's mature understanding of his method and its applications. The writing is clear and practical, free of the technical jargon and legal language that characterized his original patent application. The booklet sells steadily through word-of-mouth recommendations, though Albert makes no effort to promote it commercially. He prices it to cover printing costs and donates any modest profits to a local charity that provides assistance to working families. The booklet's success comes from its practical usefulness rather than marketing campaigns or promotional efforts. By 1920, Albert estimates that thousands of people across the Midwest are practicing some version of his systematic napping method. He receives letters from practitioners in cities and towns throughout Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, and beyond, each sharing their own adaptations and improvements to his basic technique. Some have developed versions suitable for outdoor workers, others have created variations for people with physical limitations, and a few have even adapted the method for use with children and elderly individuals. Albert realizes that his method has become something larger than he ever imagined during his patent application days. It has evolved into what he terms a folk practice, a technique that belongs to the community of people who use it rather than to any individual inventor. The systematic napping method has joined the ranks of traditional knowledge that passes from person to person, generation to generation, without need for legal protection or commercial control. This realization brings Albert a deep sense of satisfaction that patent protection could never have provided. His innovation has achieved what he now understands to be the highest form of success for a practical invention. It has become so useful and widely adopted that people think of it as natural rather than invented, as obvious rather than innovative. The method works so well and has spread so naturally that most practitioners probably have no idea it originated with a bank clerk's systematic analysis of afternoon fatigue. In 1923, Albert retires from the Merchants National Bank after 25 years of service. His colleagues organize a farewell dinner where they present him with a comfortable reclining chair specifically designed for optimal napping, custom built by one of the bank's customers who owns a furniture workshop. The chair incorporates all the principles of Albert's method: proper head and neck support, optimal arm positioning, appropriate leg elevation, but translates them into permanent furniture rather than temporary body arrangement. Retirement gives Albert more time to reflect on his unusual journey from failed patent applicant to informal expert on systematic rest. He begins work on a more comprehensive book about his experiences, not just the technical aspects of systematic napping, but the broader lessons about innovation, ownership, and the relationship between individual creativity and community benefit. The book, which Albert works on slowly and carefully throughout his retirement years, becomes his attempt to share what he has learned about the nature of practical innovation. He writes about the difference between inventing something entirely new and improving something that already exists, about the value of careful documentation, even when it doesn't lead to patent protection, and about the satisfaction that comes from contributing to human welfare without expectation of personal profit or recognition. Albert's retirement years are peaceful and productive. He continues to practice his systematic napping method daily, finding that it becomes even more valuable as he ages and his natural energy levels begin to decline. He maintains correspondence with practitioners around the country, offering advice and encouragement to people who are adapting his method to their own circumstances. In 1928, Albert receives a letter that particularly delights him, a note from a school teacher in Wisconsin who has introduced systematic napping to her classroom as a way of helping students maintain attention during the difficult post-lunch period. The teacher reports remarkable improvements in student behavior and academic performance, and she credits Albert's method with transforming her classroom environment from one of afternoon sluggishness to sustained engagement. The letter reminds Albert of the broad applicability of his systematic approach to rest. He begins to consider whether his analytical methods might be applied to other aspects of daily life that people take for granted, but that might benefit from careful observation and systematic improvement. Sleep preparation, morning routines, meal timing, work organization, all of these areas might yield to the same kind of methodical analysis that he applied to daytime napping. These thoughts lead Albert to begin a series of small experiments and observations, not with any goal of patent applications or commercial development, but simply for the pleasure of systematic investigation and the possibility of practical improvement. He develops what he calls the Weatherby approach to daily optimization, a general method for analyzing routine activities and identifying opportunities for increased efficiency and satisfaction. Albert's final years are marked by contentment and continued curiosity. He has found his place in the world as someone who helps people think more carefully about the small details of daily life that can make significant differences in overall well-being. His apartment becomes an informal consulting center where neighbors and friends come to discuss problems and challenges that might benefit from systematic analysis. When Albert passes away peacefully in his sleep in 1934, at the age of 73, his obituary in the Chicago Tribune remembers him as the man who tried to patent the nap, but also acknowledges his broader contributions to practical innovation and community welfare. The obituary notes that Albert's systematic napping method continues to be practiced by thousands of people throughout the Midwest and beyond, and that his approach to careful analysis and methodical improvement has influenced thinking about efficiency and optimization in various fields. Albert's personal effects include thousands of letters from people whose lives were improved by his method, detailed journals documenting 3 decades of systematic observation and analysis, and the manuscript of his unfinished book about practical innovation and community benefit. His friends arrange for the book to be completed and published posthumously, with proceeds supporting a small scholarship fund for students interested in practical engineering and systematic problem solving. The story of Albert Cornelius Weatherby and his failed patent application becomes a gentle legend in Chicago, told and retold as an example of how individual failure can sometimes lead to collective success, how the most valuable innovations are often those that cannot be owned or controlled, and how systematic thinking and careful observation can contribute to human welfare even when they don't result in legal recognition or financial reward. Today, nearly a century after Albert's original patent application, systematic napping has become so common and accepted that few people think of it as an invention at all. Modern research into sleep science and workplace productivity has validated many of Albert's insights about optimal restoration, body positioning, and breathing patterns, though this scientific confirmation came decades after Albert developed his method through simple observation and experimentation. Albert's story reminds us that innovation often occurs in the spaces between formal recognition and practical application, that the most valuable contributions to human welfare are sometimes those that seem too simple or obvious to merit patent protection, and that true success might be measured not by individual achievement, but by collective benefit. His systematic napping method continues to help people manage the demands of daily life, passed from person to person through the informal networks of family, friendship, and workplace community that Albert would have recognized and appreciated. In the end, Albert Cornelius Weatherby succeeded far beyond his original dreams, not by owning his innovation, but by sharing it, not by controlling its development, but by allowing it to evolve naturally, and not by seeking recognition, but by focusing on genuine usefulness. His failed patent application became the foundation for a different kind of success, one that continues to benefit people long after the bureaucratic rejection that once seemed like the end of his dreams.